Right, so hit start recording. Oh, hang on, what's going on here? Right, so we're you can see, hopefully everyone can see the screen now. So yeah, okay, so we took that break just as I said. Jesus has been in Capernaum. He's gone up to Canaan. They've had a wedding. They've moved to Capernaum, and there's a kind of a break then in the action. It refers to him being in Capernaum for a number of days, which, as I've said, I think in the past, in Jesus' day, a number of days means more than kind of a couple of weeks, because everything takes time to travel, do whatever. So it means he's there for a while. And the kind of the next time we're going to meet Jesus is AD 30's Passover. So like everybody else, they're all heading up, which probably means he's left from Capernaum. But as they go and travel, probably family have joined Jesus, because people tend to travel together in groups. They take the pilgrim route down the Jordan. They get down to the temple. And Jesus goes in, and I've got this slide up here about the bazaars of Annas, and we know the story of Jesus clearing the temple, and sometimes people have noticed John has it at the beginning of his gospel, Matthew, Mark, and Luke put it at the end, but that doesn't mean even those who are reasonably liberal in their thinking will tend to acknowledge that this doesn't mean to say that actually it's the same incident, because actually they're slightly different. So what we then conclude is that therefore Jesus clears the temple twice. And in actual fact, the issue of sellers in the temple is a really contentious one. So I've got this, it says, in the temple he found those who were selling oxen, sheep, pigeon, and money changers were sitting there. So a generation after Jesus, before the temple has been destroyed, we find in the rabbinic writings a whole load of references to the ill feeling that these markets created. And they refer to those temple markets as being the bazaars of the sons of Annas. Although this is a kind of a generation after Jesus, is about 60 AD when they're writing this, already in Jesus' day, the high priest is a man called Caiaphas, who is the son-in-law of Annas, who is the person who's in view here, the sons of Annas, because Annas had been the priest under whose kind of guidance the temple had been turned into a fantastic money-making machine. He'd been appointed by the high priest as high priest by Quirinius, who you remember from the beginning of Luke's Gospel, in the relationship of Quirinius with Jesus' birth. He actually serves from 6 to 15 AD, and he was a very astute political manipulator. And because he was so astute, that actually the next procurator, a guy called Gratus, gets rid of him. The problem, of course, is that you're not supposed to be able to get rid of a high priest. You know, the high priest was supposed to be for life, but the Romans have removed him from the office. I say it's not dissimilar to the situation you have in China and Tibet with the Dalai Lama. And then there's various lamas in Buddhism, Dalai Lama, the Panchen Lama, and actually that one, the second, who's kind of number 2 to the Dalai Lama, you have that going on at the moment, which is when the last one died, the authorities in China imposed a different Panchen Lama to the one that was chosen by the Buddhist monks. So you actually have a situation now where technically you have 2 people occupying one role, and that's not dissimilar to what's going on here. So Caiaphas is acting high priest. Really, the power behind the throne is Annas, but between him and his family, of which Caiaphas is a part, they have this incredible kind of money-making activity that goes on in the temple, which is hugely resented by people. But so when Jesus does what he does at the beginning, it's not a big event. It's actually the kind of thing that happens. But it's interesting that Jesus starts his ministry this way, because he is going to clear out the old leaven. He is making a new way, and putting something of real spirit back at the heart of the religious system of Judaism. So we had that, and I had that yeah, I've got the little quote from Malachi, behold, I send my messenger. So we've had John the Baptist, he'll prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come into his temple. And in this kind of incident of Jesus arriving and clearing out to the money changers, we kind of have that the sense of that suddenly. So he makes the whip of cords and drove out all of the temple courts with the sheep and the oxen, and he scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. I think we're not supposed to imagine him whipping people, although it says the them, because it would make Jesus incredibly hypocritical when later he talks about turning the other cheek and not resisting evil with evil. But the word for the scourge that he's got is a thing that used for driving the animals, and so you actually have these huge pens of animals which are if you like, officially franchised by the priesthood for sacrifice, but they're costing multiple times more than they should do. And they've kind of developed this system. It started with as the feasts were coming up, and various butchers from Judea would start to kind of gather around outside the temple. And so the whole pilgrim route, they took control of that and said, no, if you want to sell here, you have to pay us a royalty first. So now we've only got, say, a handful of butchers that are allowed to sell animals as you're coming in as a pilgrim. The hundreds of thousands of pilgrims that would come up for Passover, for instance, or any of the other feasts, as you're coming up the walkway, you're paying a fee to be there as a butcher selling your stuff. And then when they realize as they get really kind of key in, let's now bring them right inside the temple, and these are the best ones. And but of course now you're trading in the temple, not outside the temple. So if you're trading in the temple, you can only do it using money that's pure and clean. So first of all, you have to change your money with the money changers before you can start to transact, and then you have to buy an overpriced animal to sacrifice, and those are the only ones that we will sacrifice. So by the time you add all those things together, it was just kind of minting it in. And we kind of read in this kind of context that this is incredibly unpopular and people regularly cause trouble, and so as a result, the temple servants reportedly use sticks on pilgrims if they start to get antsy, because you can imagine someone turns up from the far corners of the empire. They've come in all happy to celebrate their faith, and they're going to offer a sacrifice. And they discover that before they can, first of all, they have to exchange their money at an exorbitant rate for special temple coins. So their big gold coin becomes a little tiny gold coin, and then those little tiny gold coins only buy. You have to use quite a lot of them to buy your sacrifice, and so of course it would cause angst. And as a result, the temple guard, who were made up of Levites, who were from families that were appointed by the high priests, would carried sticks with them to deal with pilgrims. And so we have to think of that in the context of what Jesus is doing. So there is a temple guard, but Jesus catches them by surprise, turns over the tables, and to those who sold the doves, he said, "Take these things away from here. Don't you know? And don't make my Father's house a marketplace." And in making that, using that phrase, a marketplace, actually, he draws in to a kind of a part of the prophetic context of Zechariah, which I put in the verse just below. Zechariah is talking about a day, if you like, a fantastic day. And it talks about the cooking pots in Yahweh's house will be as holy as the bowls in front of the altar. So in other words, that someone just comes in with a cooking pot and it's still holy. It doesn't require, if you like, the sanctification of the process and the priesthood. Every cooking pot in Jerusalem and Judea will become holy. So something has so happened in the city, something has so happened in the nation that it doesn't have to be marked out for long periods, and specially washed and specially anointed and specially consecrated by the priests. So that everyone who offers sacrifice may come and use some of them. In other words, they're coming in with whatever to boil their sacrifices in them. And on that day, there will no longer be a trader. And I put there, some of your translations will put Canaanite, and the reason for that is because the Canaanites, the word for Canaanite became the word for a trader, because that's what they did. They went with their ships and they were merchants. But there will no longer be a trader in the house of the Lord who rules over you. So there's this prophecy in Zechariah about actually a holiness that is hitting the people, so that when they're coming into the temple, it's not so much that the temple is making them holy, but just what they're bringing in and what they're bringing in are being acceptable to the Lord, and he's able to receive those offerings from them. So you got this kind of, I've put there, note the connection between unclean Gentiles and trade being done because of the priestly privileges. So there's this kind of context that people are looking forward to in the Messianic age, where actually there's something about the people that is bringing their holiness rather than receiving it. And that's, I think, is a part of the flow here. So Jesus said you shouldn't make it a marketplace. It's a very clear, it's not a quote, but it's a clear reference to this passage in Zechariah of where they're heading and what John has come to prepare for and what Jesus is going to release, which this marketplace stands as a kind of the complete opposite of it. And in this kind of place of the argument, so you can imagine here, as he's done all of this, and the temple guards start moving in. The temple guards only got 21 people in it, so it's not an enormous team, but they kind of start to surround the situation and deal with it. And the Jews say to him, it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it up in 3 days, because he talks about destroy this temple, I'll raise it up. He's speaking of his own body. And that kind of reference, it helps us kind of lock this moment in time. There are a couple of possibilities, but the story was that when Herod had been made king of the Jews by the Romans, so they voted on him and made him king of the Jews, and he took a Roman army to make sure that everybody accepted him as king of the Jews. So he wasn't popular, and he was seen as an Edomite. So he wanted to establish his Jewish credentials. So he started to rebuild the temple in 19 or 18 BC, which is the 18th year of his rule. That's according to Josephus. And he kind of restores the broken down temple because it's been attacked several times, about 18 months later. And around 17 BC, he starts a brand new building project to extend the temple and add new courtyards and so on. And that new building work is the place where Jesus is standing, when he clears the temple, and so that's actually 46 years before 30 AD when where the place where Jesus is standing, the work had started on it. So it's a kind of it implies probably a start of Jesus' ministry of 30 AD. Those that see Jesus' ministry as starting kind of more like 27 AD. Part of the way they deal with this is they say, well, actually, it probably goes right from when he first kind of tidied up the temple. But I think the timing, for other reasons, is clearly Jesus starts in, to me, it makes more sense for Jesus starting his ministry in 30 AD, in which case we're understanding that the very place he's standing was started 46 years ago, which is hence why the reference is there. Let's keep going. I can't remember what I've got next. Yeah, so in that context, Jesus is kicked out of the temple, but it's not the same as at the end of his ministry, where he's now a huge figure with thousands of people and thousands of followers, and of the hundreds of thousands of pilgrims that come into Jerusalem have followed Jesus in as he's ridden in on a donkey, and then the next day he comes and clears out the temple, and that's a real threat, which is why it results in Jesus' death. Here he's just some hothead from Galilee. Nobody would really have noticed him, even if he's had some special privileges with John and John the Baptist ministry. He's just another of those pilgrims that's creating problems. So he kind of gets knocked around a bit, he gets argued with, shoved a bit, and thrown out of the temple. And it says there he starts to do something in terms of ministry. We're not sure what, but there's something that people feel because they see it as the fulfillment of the baptism of the Holy Spirit. So although we don't hear about physical miracles, they're feeling something just outside the temple. And it's in that context that Nicodemus is going to come to Jesus. So Josephus tells us that Jerusalem's leading elite were the chief priests and leading men of the Pharisees, and it's two slightly different groups. The Sadducees, who are the chief priests, came about that title, the Sadducees, came about because there was when the temple was being restored, and then there were kind of in the intertestamental period, there were various phases where Jerusalem was doing quite well and receiving a certain amount of independence. There was a kind of a mass people movement which became known as the Pharisees, which saw the temple life as the centre of their Jewish religious experience, and they wanted to honour the temple and so on. And originally the high priests were all part of that. But in the priestly family, in the Maccabean family, there's a famous leader who's part of the kind of the restoration of the temple, called John Hyrcanus, and he gets into an argument with the leaders of this popularist movement, the Pharisees, and they make a reference to the fact that they're not really sure whether he is his mother's son because she was a bit of a sleep around, and he takes offence at this. See, the world doesn't change; it's just the way it goes on. And so he creates a breakaway movement called the Sadducees, who are also they understand their religious existence devoted to the temple, but the difference is the Sadducees control the temple, whereas the Pharisees they see their religious life revolve around the temple, but now they've been excluded from it. And so you have this kind of tension and a trade-off, because the Sadducees need the popular support of the Pharisees, but they don't get on particularly, and the Sadducees kind of become clever and intellectual. They don't believe in angels, they don't believe in resurrection, they don't believe any of these things. The Pharisees are more your kind of popularist movement. They believe in all of those things, but they both need each other, because the whole Pharisees' point of existence is the temple, but the temple is controlled by a group they don't really get on with, but they can't really always be overly critical of. And between the two of them, they end up being at the heart of the council of that goes. You follow the model of the council of elders. You've got the 12, and then you have the 70, right the way back to the days of the Exodus, the 12 and the 70 mix, which of course is going to be replicated in Jesus' ministry, 12 and then the 70. And the Sanhedrin is the kind of the 70 is sometimes understood a little bit broader than the 70. It was a sort of symbolic 70 that is made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. Gamaliel, who trained Paul, is part of this group. Nicodemus, therefore, is part of this group. What's that? And his son Simon. I think Simon, the son of Gamaliel. So they're so it's the members, though, are all incredibly wealthy. They're a handful of the wealthiest lay people were considered to be part of this Sanhedrin. Which kind of helps us to understand and see the character of Nicodemus. Nicodemus means the conqueror of the people. And it's actually a Greek name. It's an unusual Greek name. So he's a Jew with an unusual name because it's a Greek one. He's not the only person in the Bible with a Jew with a Greek name. But conqueror of the people has a very specific historical kind of pedigree to it. And it seems to enter into kind of Jewish history along that time of the Maccabean expansion, where I was talking about the Maccabean leaders and so on. If you go right the way back there, you find the first person with the name Nicodemus. And he's referred to by Josephus, who also mentions a later Nicodemus. So Josephus refers to a kind of an early Nicodemus, which means conqueror of the people, who is there at a time when the Maccabean revolution is taking new territory. And actually, he seems to become quite wealthy at that point, as is often the way. If he's an important military leader, he is honoured by given territory. And so we kind of root back to this historic character. And then we discover Josephus also refers to another Nicodemus, who he refers to as the son of Gurion, Ben Gurion. And Gurion is a very important, so this is secular history rather than Christian history, but actually you see how it fits together with the gospel. So we have an early Nicodemus and we have a later Nicodemus at just before the time when the Romans conquer Jerusalem and destroy the temple. And then Nicodemus Ben Gurion. Gurion is more contemporary with Jesus. He's actually just a few years before Jesus, and he's an important financial backer of the Pharisee movement. So the Nicodemus family, because the names run in families, that's one of the key things. They don't. It's not like today where people arbitrarily choose names from any old place. So whoever's currently in. So I remember that a few years ago reading that the name Pitt was being used because Brad Pitt was really popular. It's not a proper name. It's the surname of a famous actor, and people just kind of sorry, if anyone watching is called Pitt, I do apologise. But our habit now is we kind of invent names, just pull them in from anywhere, but that isn't the way in the ancient world. So the name belongs in a family. So you have this family, and that Nicodemus Ben Gurion, who's there when the Romans come to destroy Jerusalem and destroy the city, is considered to be one of the three wealthiest men in Jerusalem at the time of the destruction. So you have someone who as a military leader has been gifted with wealth, going right the way down to someone who's considered to be one of the three wealthiest men, and that is therefore the family that Nicodemus exists within. This Nicodemus is part of that. Gurion, who we also know, although he's not a Pharisee as a leader, he is a patron of the Pharisees, and he helps them convene their councils. We know this from the rabbinic writings. He's a patron of a very famous Pharisee called Hillel, and so he hosts them and so on. And that is to say that almost, well, not almost certainly, I'd say 100% certainly, the Nicodemus that we read about in John's Gospel is within this family. If you try and kind of reconstruct a family tree, what you're looking at here, so you got that Nicodemus, the military leader, who's taken the Greek name, conqueror of the people, because he's won some victories, he's been gifted properties, probably from the areas he's conquered, but his family starts therefore to do well in terms of wealth. We don't know how many generations. We get down to Gurion, who's a reasonably well-known, famous patron of the Pharisees, who's particularly the kind of financial backer for Hillel, who's one of the two most important Pharisees in Jesus' day. He's dead by now, but his generation before, him and another guy, Samaria. Most synagogues kind of belong to one of their two schools. They're the two dominant. It's like two denominations within things. So they either tend to be Hillelite or Shammite synagogues. Of course, a lot of people, I guess, who worship at them don't really bother with the distinction, but this is the way it kind of is working. And we know that Gurion has 3 children, because there's the Nicodemus who Josephus refers to, who also sometimes gets referred to as Bunni. And who is this very wealthy and wise ruler in the rabbinic writings, who has 2 children we know of, Miriam and Gurion as well. Can you see that pattern there? Gurion, and he has a son who is also called Gurion. That's a very common pattern. We're going to see that again elsewhere. So he also has a son, Joseph, on the other side, who also has a son, Gurion, because that's one of the habits in naming, is to honor and recognize a grandfather or an uncle in the naming of your children. And there's a third line, Hezekiah, Hananiah, Eleazar, that we can actually trace. We can build these records up from the rabbinic writings. So where does Jesus is Nicodemus, if I can put it that way, the Nicodemus from the Gospel, where does he fit? And while we can't be 100% sure, as I said, Palestinian families tend to keep names within the family, and the most common association is grandfather to grandchild, or from uncle to nephew. So you notice that in Jesus's family. So Joseph is the son of Jacob. So Jesus' adoptive father, Joseph, is the son of Jacob, and Jesus' oldest brother is also called Jacob, or we translate Jacob as James. So you can see that same pattern running in Jesus' family, and that's part of the context when John the Baptist is called John the Baptist. But there's nobody in your family called John. It's not that John is a weird name. It wasn't. It's just that there's no. Why on earth are you doing that? You're not following conventions. This doesn't make any of the usual familiar connections. So given that we know Nicodemus is an unusual name and doesn't seem to exist outside of this family, it's very kind of clear that he has to kind of fit into the usual naming patterns. Which therefore, okay, I've got another slide here first. It's interesting though to notice that there is a reference to what is probably Nicodemus in the rabbinic writings, as is associated as being a disciple of Jesus, which is unusual. What happens is his reference. Well, it's not a reference. It's information that's been drawn out of the Talmud. So in the Talmud, which is to do with the oral teachings of the rabbis over the centuries, there's an incident that is a kind of polemic against a character called Yeshu, who is almost universally understood now by scholars. It used to be argued about, but not really so anymore. Yeshu is clearly Jesus, and he's seen as a bad rabbi and a bad person who led people astray. And in the Talmud, there's a kind of a polemic against Yeshu, and it has a mock trial of 5 disciples. And the disciples are named using kind of scriptural wordplay on the shortened versions of their names. But actually we can identify them with the various disciples of Jesus. So there is a character called Mattai, which is kind of short for Matthias or Matthew. There's a character called Naki, which seems to be short for Nicodemus. It's Naki, Nakdimon Nicodemus, I think is the word play. There's a Nessa or Nittai, which seems to be short for Nathaniel. There's the Bunny, which I've referenced and I've highlighted. Bunny seems to be actually a name that you find within the Gurian family. It seems to be a name that kind of belongs to Gurian. It perhaps is short for Benaniah, as one thought. Another possibility is it could, of course, be, do you remember Jesus calls James and John Boanerges? And that Boanerges, that Boa bit, is Boan bit, I should say, is because it's sons of thunder, and the Bunny Benny is meaning sons of, so it could be them as well. And then Todai, which is Thaddeus from Tadai. So you have in the Talmuds, you have this kind of mock trial of the disciples of Yeshua, who's the terrible rabbi who's led people astray, and they kind of do a word play, which seems to be based on the shortened versions of the names. And in there is one that identifies with the name Nicodemus, which is an unusual name and probably doesn't exist outside of the Gurian family. So it's one of these nice little kind of historical evidences of the authenticity of the gospel. The Talmuds refer to a disciple called Nicodemus. The Gospels refer to a rabbi who seems to kind of move onto the edge and eventually becomes identified as a disciple of Nicodemus. We kind of put them all together and you kind of got this consistent picture. So he's probably one of the same. It's probably not the same one who's cited. Yeah, he's not the one who's quoted in the Talmud as being the wealthiest man one of the three wealthiest men in Israel, but he's clearly part of that family. That's what that one is. Because the Nicodemus ben Gurion, who's referred to by Josephus and is in the Talmud, is remembered as being thoroughly Jewish, but John's Nicodemus becomes a public supporter. But we've seen there's also seems to be a reference to a Nicodemus in the who's associated in the Talmuds as being a disciple of Jesus. So he eventually, of course, in the Talmud story, all of the disciples get sentenced to death. Now it's a kind of polemic. It's not real history. It's kind of it's what people wished would have happened to them. They all get executed and sentenced to death. So the Nicodemus in the Talmud story of who's a disciple of Jesus is not seen so favourably. So we meet him in John. When we meet this Nicodemus, therefore, in John, we've got historical context that tells us something about him. So he's not just a patron of the Pharisees, he's actually a rabbi in John's Gospel. And so in his own right, and he's senior enough in the family that he's part of the Sanhedrin. Because there's limited numbers in the Sanhedrin, but there are key wealthy families. They will have 2 or 3 members of the family will probably be on the Sanhedrin, but not thousands and thousands. It's a limited small group, which would imply at this point, I think I've got, here we go, something like this, that Nicodemus is actually a brother perhaps of Gurion, who's actually become the member of the family who's actually kind of gone into kind of ministry. He's become a rabbi. He sits representing the family as a council member, and as I just kind of dragged, and I've kind of got a point over on the other side. You notice that Joseph, there's a character in that same family called Joseph who's referred to. I put there of Arimathea, because we think of Joseph of Arimathea, who's also a council member with Nicodemus, and the two of them go and take Jesus's body. And actually, we have within the family structure a Joseph, and that Arimathea actually could be a reference to him. We can't be 100% sure. I've put the kind of question mark. There's also an interesting tie-in, because Joseph of Arimathea could be a good candidate for being the rich young ruler that we read about towards the end of Jesus' ministry around Jericho, which we know the family has property in that area. A man comes to Jesus who's both wealthy, he's young, and he's a ruler. And that word ruler, you got 2 possibilities. He's either a ruler in the Roman context, so Herod, or the civil context, I should say. So Herod's family has kind of sub-rulers and so on associated with it, but more likely what it means is he's part of the Sanhedrin, the ruling council. And as we said, if he's a devout man who seems to be a rabbi who's kept all of the law and all of the commandments, and he's wealthy at this point, So actually, he's a good contender. Joseph in the Gurian family is a good contender for being Joseph of Arimathea, who is also perhaps the rich young ruler. So we can't be 100% sure, but I kind of increasingly feel that these are good character fits for these people. And it kind of creates a sort of a narrative. Oh, I've gone through 2 slides there. Let's jump back one. Oh, okay. I've not put a lot in here. When I've done this, I'm going to refer to this. Oh, no, I've gone too far forwards. Hang on, let's go back. In the story in John's Gospel, if you remember it, Nicodemus comes at night. And we often think of that as him kind of sneaking in to see Jesus, but actually at night is a time when you sit and discuss and you eat. So I can remember actually going through Sunday school with fuzzy felt. And the fuzzy felt images, if anybody else is old enough to remember these things, back in the days before video, you used to stick these fuzzy felt characters on the board to tell Bible stories. And the fuzzy felt story of Nicodemus and Jesus has Nicodemus sneaking through the door and has Jesus kind of sitting up in bed to talk to him. That actually isn't the case. The case is actually much more, you notice both Jesus and Nicodemus refer to we. They don't mean we as in the two of us talking now. They're talking in terms of the group that's with them. So actually here we have at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he's not well known, he's an unknown, he's come down, he's turned over the money tables, but actually as a Pharisee, Nicodemus is not anti that. He understands it. He's not part of the money making process there because he's not a Sadducee. And so it generates some interest, and Jesus gets kicked outside the temple, but the pilgrims are all coming in towards the temple on the same roads, and Jesus is out there outside the temple ministering to people, and something significant is happening. And at some point, wherever Jesus is staying in this context, Nicodemus comes as a leader of the Pharisees, presumably with a group of his own disciples, who is the we, and they have a conversation with Jesus. And when you see that, if you've ever read it, it kind of can seem a little bit like Jesus is being rude to Nicodemus, but in actual fact what they're following is a kind of standard teacher's dialogue. The way in which it works is Nicodemus is asking questions that Jesus can respond to in a way that illustrate and make a point. Some of the points some of the questions he asks therefore are probably deliberately naive to allow Jesus to speak to them, and that you kind of, if you read it that way, you see it in a slightly different light. I've just realised I've spelt the name Joseph wrong. So that's just a tiny point on this slide, but if anyone's noticed it, I've now noticed it too. Joseph. Okay. What have I got there? Nicodemus and Joseph. That should be Nicodemus. Oh yeah, that's Nicodemus and Joseph. Sorry, that's a slide from behind, wasn't it? So yeah, sorry, I'm going back to the narrative of Jesus teaching. So Jesus has probably got a group of his disciples, so he talks about the we, and Nicodemus has probably got a group of his disciples, and Nicodemus is asking Jesus slightly stylized questions, and Jesus is giving slightly kind of performance focused responses, and it's part of the way of kind of conveying information between the two learning communities. And that's kind of is the first point, but it's not a public place, it is a private place. But it's not that Jesus was in bed at this point, because people actually work through the night in the Middle Eastern world, because it's so hot at midday, everyone has to have a rest, so they wake up later, and there's time for food and eating and discussion and teaching that goes on into the evening. So anyway, let's leave that. But that all happens at that first time down in Jerusalem. So Jesus now he heads out of Jerusalem, and he goes to Bethabara, where John the Baptist has been ministering, but John has vacated it, maybe by agreement. And it's a key kind of period because it's the holiday season between Passover and Pentecost, so there's still loads and loads of people who are actually living in this kind of region just outside and west of Jerusalem. And so Jesus goes and starts baptizing through his disciples at Bethabara. And we read there, now when Jesus knew, that the Pharisees had heard that he was now winning and baptizing more disciples than John, he left Judea. So there seems to be something of needing to kind of create a moment to understand, so that Jesus is kind of creating a sense which publicly now he's been acknowledged by Pharisees coming, because the Pharisees are not all bad, if I can put it that way. They become a problem but they were people who were wanting the best, if I can put it that way. But in their desiring the best, they became proud, and that becomes the sort of problem. And in that context, Jesus is making an impact into them. They've had one of their senior rabbis has brought a delegation to have a conversation with Jesus, and it's not going to be all plain sailing, but there's clearly a dialogue beginning to go on, and this is part of that. Part of the dialogue is for them to see that Jesus is now making disciples, and they're coming to him. But in that context, Jesus leaves Judea, and he's setting out towards Galilee, and he decides to take the direct route, which takes them back through Samaria. So they come to a town of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the field of Jacob that he'd given his son Joseph. Just kind of that's just putting it in as a quote. And we know the story, but sometimes we miss the significance. So if I kind of go back, we all know, for instance, you Bethlehem Ephrathah, this is when Jesus is born. From you shall come one who will be a ruler in Israel, and he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labour has given birth, and he will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord. Now, I've highlighted Israel because often in our minds, Israel means everybody, but it doesn't. At the time when Micah is writing this, Israel has become Samaria. So Israel is synonymous with the area we think of as, Israel is synonymous with the area we now think of as Samaria in Jesus' day. One who will be a ruler in Israel, so he shall give them up. In other words, Israel has been given up until the time when she who is in labour has given birth, which of course is the context the Messiah has come, in other words, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord. So Micah is prophesying that Israel, which has now lost its kind of autonomy, and as a result of losing its autonomy, the Babylonians forcibly bring new populations in, and the Samaritans now have a kind of syncretistic religion that involves elements of paganism, but alongside their old Hebraistic faith in Yahweh. But that particular territory, Galilee has already been lost, so Galilee is not thought of as Israel, but at the time when Micah is writing, it's what the region of the country which we now think of as Samaria. So I've got there, Israel, the northern kingdom, has now become Samaria. It's been given up, and it's awaiting a shepherd ruler from Bethlehem, according to Micah. So Bethlehem, which is in Judea, which Jesus has been born into, and he is going to become a shepherd to them. And so actually that's part of what we start to see going on here. We can see Jesus has this, a relationship with Samaria which is often positive, even though the Samaritans are often suspicious of Jesus. And here's a kind of a good context of it. And I said it's actually presented to us in John's Gospel very, very deliberately as a kind of betrothal scene. It's what kind of follows in the encounter as Jesus arrives in Samaria is like a classical biblical betrothal. So think of the stories of Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel, or Moses and Zipporah. They all follow the same pattern. So what tends to happen is the groom or representative comes to a well, and while they're at the well, the bride arrives. And then there's a conversation that goes on, and there's a request made for water, and there's an exchange of water. And then there's an exchange of promises as well. At that point, the bride normally leaves, or to tell her relatives, and then the relatives kind of come, and there's joy and fruitfulness and celebration. So that's the kind of the standard sort of betrothal scene of important characters from Israel's past. And of course, Jesus kind of replicates this with this woman at the well. So what's going on, if I can put it that way, is if you take an Old Testament context again, Jeremiah 3 describes how Yahweh has formally divorced Israel because of her pagan practices, but he is actually hoping for her to return, which has an interesting kind of tension in it, because obviously the law kind of says you shouldn't remarry after you've divorced, but here is God saying, I've divorced you, but my hope is one day you will come back. But God is allowed to do those kinds of things. There is a logic that is very practical in terms of what he's establishing with people when he says you're not allowed to redo it, which we see actually in parts of the world today where divorce isn't really divorce. It's kind of just a way of punishing an individual within a marriage, and they can be pulled in and out and so on and so forth. So God is stopping that, but he's expressing a desire that although he's divorced Israel, he wants her to come back. So for all the adulteries of that faithless one Israel, I've sent her away with a decree of divorce. So go and proclaim these words towards the north and say, return, faithless Israel, declares Yahweh. I will not be angry forever, only acknowledge your guilt. So Jeremiah, we have that clear statement both of divorce but desire for her to return. And so there's a kind of a sense in which Jesus is remarrying Israel, who's going to acknowledge her need in this kind of moment as we kind of think our way through it. So okay, because this is rather speedy. In my head, I've got loads more things to say on this bit, so I'll try and say them quickly. The lady at the well is not actually. We often treat her as immoral. She's not really treated that way. In the text, she's probably better understanding is she is unfortunate. When Jesus, it says you've had 4 husbands and the man you're living with now is not your husband. There are various kind of takes on that, but most of the serious ones don't see it as that she's kind of got around quite a few men. It's much more likely that either the people have died or she herself has been divorced. But she seems to be respected by the elders of the community because they come out when she goes and talks to them. It's a bit too simplistic to see her just simply as a kind of an immoral person. And the person she's living with who's not her husband may even be another family member who's taken her in because of the misfortune that she's gone through and so on and so forth. But anyway, in that context, we know how it goes. So Jesus has that interaction, as I say. She goes and brings the crowds out, and there's great celebration, and they receive Jesus, and it says, we now believe him. We're believing this man, and it's not because of what the woman said to us, it's what we've received. And so they respond to Jesus, but Jesus doesn't do any miracles for them. He just teaches and preaches, and somehow he draws them back into the process. But he's got to head further north to Galilee. And in that context, other little sidelines, it talks about 4 months to harvest, which means it's probably June, because 4 months to harvest is not a saying. It doesn't belong as a saying. It doesn't just mean kind of. It really does seem to mean 4 months to harvest. So it's probably around June time when this is going on. And Jesus is now saying, but we need to keep heading north. We're heading up to Galilee. And he actually, in that context, he compares the expectations of Galilee, where in Galilee he says people are only going to be interested in miracles. He compares it with the faith of the Samaritans, where he hasn't done any miracles, but they've received him with kind of great joy. And so we've got the verses there from John. Jesus himself testified that a prophet has no honour except in his own country. So there's this kind of strange situation where the people who are traditionally antagonistic towards Jerusalem receiving Jesus well, which is perhaps at this beginning of this is beginning to see that the ruler who's born in Bethlehem is actually good news for Israel, which is now called Samaria. He's also going to be good news for Galilee. He's going to tie all the different parts of God's people back together again. It's going to be good news for Galilee, Galilee of the north, Galilee of the Gentiles. It's going to be good news for the middle ground, which was Israel, Samaria. He's going to be good news for Judea down in the south. So, he heads back to Galilee. For whatever reason, Jesus seems to either pass through or deliberately avoids going back to Nazareth at that point. But he actually, again, we've got this, unless these people see signs and wonders, they won't believe. There's something in Jesus, even as he's heading north, where he knows there's going to be an expectation on him, which is not the heart of what he is about. While Jesus is hugely significant because of his healing ministry, there is something where it's not the key focus of what he wants them to get hold of. I often say it this way, there is nobody, if we're really honest, there's nobody who becomes a Christian for a good motive. We all want something or we're scared of something. and God does meet us in that. But there's something in Jesus which at this point knows that that's going to be the case. He wishes it wasn't. He wishes it was something different. But in the end, he knows that's the way it's going to be. And that's going to create problems at certain points, because when we're only there because it's going well for us, there's always the challenge that comes along that then feels like, well, that's not very godly. That's not the way God dealt with me. He's always given me stuff up to now. Now suddenly there's an expectation. And we find that awkward. And somehow I think Jesus is anticipating that as he goes up to Galilee, comes through Samaria, where you should expect him not to be well received, but he is well received, and works through that kind of, if you like, we're beginning to draw these guys back in. And so when he comes to Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. Why? It says because they'd seen all the things he'd done in Jerusalem. In other words, they'd heard about the miracles, and that seems really exciting to them. So he came again to Cana in Galilee, where he'd made water into the wine. And there was a certain royal official there whose son was sick at Capernaum. So it seems that the royal official has come up to if his son is down in Capernaum, the royal official has come up to Cana, and it's probably to meet Jesus there. So Jesus has gone there. And we think about that royal official. There's only a small number of people the royal official could be. They must be part of Herod's household. And we do know of one in the end, whose wife, of course, becomes a follower of Jesus and a financial supporter. So in Luke, we read about Joanna, the wife of Chusa, who is Herod's household manager. We read about this in the context of up in Galilee, and also Susanna and many others who provided for them out of their own resources. That's one possibility. There's only one other possibility, I think, realistically, which is Manian, but I think he's less likely to be the this royal official. Manian is referred to now. There were prophets and teachers in the church of Antioch, and one of whom is Manian, who was a close friend of Herod the Tetrarch from childhood. So he's not presented as being, if you like, a part of the ruling household. He's just a friend of Herod. But Chusa is. So we meet the character in Luke's gospel. In Matthew and Mark, they would probably avoid using his name, because actually Matthew and Mark are written in the context where there is a persecution through the Herodian family of some of Jesus's disciples and his followers. If you remember, when we did that, if you were there in that first session, we looked at the narrative, the way in which the Gospels came about. In the 40s, Herod Agrippa is kind of creating tension and pressure for the early church. So those two Gospels that have been born out of that context aren't likely to want to kind of name family names of people who are probably still associated with the Herodian family. So they don't tell us the details. He's just a royal official. We get to Luke's Gospel, who's writing a little bit later. The persecution is not so intense, and he's writing for an audience that aren't in Jerusalem. He's writing for an audience around the Aegean Sea, and he's able to give us a bit more detail and calls the royal official Chusa. I'm assuming, you hear it that way. He tells us about a royal official called Chusa, and I think the two probably are the same. And you can build a picture, because actually, of course, the royal official's son gets healed, which you can imagine would make his wife quite happy. Happy to the degree that she's willing to kind of follow Jesus from a distance and support what he's doing from her own resources. And that's not an unusual story at all. We kind of that happens quite regularly right the way through kind of history, where people with influence receive a miracle. They are often they open doors and create resource access for the kind of ministries that were involved in delivering those things to them. So that seems to be, the kind of the incidents where that family gets tied in to into the story of Jesus. And now at some point in this arrival here in Galilee, John the Baptist is going to be arrested. So John's Gospel has told us that Jesus has left Galilee because he realised that more people were coming to him at Bethbara than were coming to John the Baptist. And he heads off to get towards Galilee. John is still ministering at that point in Ainon, which is kind of up the River Jordan. They stop in Sychar, as you said. They're there for a few days. They head on from there. They come into Galilee. So what have I got here? It seems at some point after arrival in Galilee that John is arrested, and there's a kind of 10-month gap that is ignored by John's Gospel between chapters 4 and 5. So at some point in that kind of 10 months between the first arrival, they're not touring yet in Galilee, but just physically there, but in a more perhaps a low-key way. At some point in that process, John is arrested. and that becomes the trigger for Jesus more actively now starting his ministry in Galilee. But this is the period which I touched on earlier, where there's still some ongoing kind of synagogue to synagogue type of ministry, but it's not in the big kind of public way at this stage. In terms of John's arrest, trying to put a date on it, all the historic denominations celebrate, I don't know if that's the right word, but they recognise John the Baptist's beheading on August the 29th. I put that's hard to reconcile with gospel accounts, but I'm not so sure now if that's the case. I need to rework that, so you may want to ignore that line. but the thing that I am kind of more aware of is that the date of John's execution would be fuzzier in people's heads, because Herod was embarrassed about the fact he's executed John, so he's not going to go and announce it as a public decree. By the way, on today, this is the day I killed John. It's news that would gradually creep out. But John's arrest was very public, and so I wonder if the August the 29th is a possibility for actually remembering the fact that John's arrest, which ends up in his beheading, kind of perhaps was around the August the 29th. So as I say, it's unlikely that anyone knows the exact date of the execution because it happens in private, but his arrest was public. So it's possible that that's a kind of, if you like, a cultural memory that of John's arrest. So maybe it's the middle of the year now. So if you remember, Jesus has been down at Passover, cleared out the temples. Between Passover and Pentecost, he's headed out to the east. He's been baptizing in Bethbara, where John the Baptist has previously been, while there's lots of pilgrims there. Because of all the pilgrims, there's a huge amount of baptisms happening. That word hits the Pharisees, and Jesus kind of sees that as, that's okay, we've done what we needed to do now, and I need to kind of head back towards Galilee. As he goes up towards Galilee, he's there in Samaria, and that seems significant. So we have the record given in John, and it's presented almost like a remarriage. They come into Galilee and they kind of disperse, and they're in their locations with perhaps some things, little bits of ministry going on. But at some point around, so the dating is not bad in this sense. At August 29th, perhaps in the summer, John is arrested, and that triggers something, which is the next phase, where actually now that John has gone, that is almost the sign to Jesus. When I say gone, he's not been executed at this stage, he's just been arrested. Now is the sign. Jesus has honourably waited, if you like. John has already said that Jesus needs to increase, that he has to decrease, that Jesus might increase. They know that the transition is going to happen, but it seems that the arrest of John becomes the transition, where Jesus now steps into a much more public role and starts to become much more deliberately bigger than John, if I can put it that way. And I don't mean that in a kind of self-promoting way. I mean, I think, as we've said, it was the natural flow, but there's still something honouring of Jesus towards John and his role. And in that context, therefore, I put the rejection in Nazareth, which is not yet the part of the first tour of Jesus, but he's in Galilee. He comes to Nazareth. It's perhaps around the same sort of period that John is being arrested. And it says, when they heard this, all the people in the synagogue... Oh, sorry, I've forgotten to tell the story. So you know the story. Jesus reads from Isaiah and says, this has now happened. This is now being fulfilled. The things that were prophesied by Isaiah, which included the coming of John, and then there's the suffering servant that's in Isaiah. Those things that I've just read to you about, they're now happening. It's kind of almost his declaration, which perhaps ties in with the arrest of John, that this is now the start of this season. And they love that but they're wanting miracles, and they're asking for miracles. And he says, no, actually, that there are people from all over the place that will have more access than you, and they get annoyed with that and angry with that, because they think this is the town he grew up in. This is the synagogue where we taught him to read. Maybe even the person who taught Jesus to read is there in the synagogue, and he's just talking about generally everybody has access, not just us. They're expecting their special privilege. And in one sense, what we're seeing here in Luke's gospel is the fulfillment of what we saw touched on in some of the other gospels, in John's gospel and so on, that he's nervous of coming into Galilee because he knows it's not going to go quite the way they expect, because they have expectations of him which he's not going to fulfill. He's going to fulfill other expectations way beyond what they would imagine, but some of the things in terms of special privilege, special place, special access are not going to be available for them. And it's those things when he hears that Jesus saying that I'm for a much wider audience, that makes them angry, and they take him to the edge of the cliff. And this is Mount Precipice, which is on the edge of where Nazareth is. And they kind of drag him up there. They want to throw him off. And we kind of get to a point where we're actually seeing now a fulfillment of Psalm 91, which is where we started. Because actually, God's provision over Jerusalem isn't going to let him get thrown off a cliff and hurt his foot. And we don't know exactly how it happens. Is it because is it because Jesus kind of stands tall and kind of walks with confidence through them, or is it because in the melee of trying to drag Jesus out of the village and up to the cliff edge, in the kind of shoving and pushing, that somehow or other he just kind of slips on through the crowd and they're all kind of moving on, and they get there and think, hang on, where is he? We don't know. We don't know that story. It could be either way, but somehow or other there's been a kind of place of divine protection that stops Jesus' having his foot dashed against the rock. So in a nice kind of way, we actually see all of the temptations of the devil, which is where we started today. Once Jesus steps into his ministry, we actually see all of the things that the devil challenges him on. Provision of bread in the wilderness, it happens, doesn't it, with the feeding of the 5,000. Not allowing you to dash your foot on the rock, that happens here. The beginning of his ministry. What was the last one? And of course the nations coming to him. Well, actually, we have various points where we find different people from different nations coming to Jesus through the process. So we see all of the things that were part of that challenge actually are fulfilled in this now the new kind of public phase of Jesus' ministry, which all kind of starts here in Nazareth, probably with the coincidence with the arrest of John the Baptist. But of course he's clearly rejected by his hometown, and although Jesus is going to go back there, sorry, I take a swig of my coffee. Lukewarm, lovely. At this point it makes sense for Jesus to move away from there, and he's already established kind of, if you like, a living relationship with his disciples over in Capernaum. So he leaves Nazareth and starts heading down towards Capernaum. We may look next time, I'm not sure, it depends how much time we've got, at the kind of integrating the story of the call of Simon. But as he arrives there in Capernaum, for now, because we're running towards the end, he goes and lodges with Simon. Simon is one of those. There is a house that's been discovered. This is the photograph here is taken from Biblical Archaeological Review, which kind of, it says this is it's almost certainly, as much as an academic would say, is the house of Simon. The reason we know that, I put that almost certainly in brackets, it was discovered about 30 years ago, is that it's a kind of cooperative business type house. So it's got several kind of buildings around a courtyard, and which is probably therefore the heart of this fishing business. So Peter is not just a kind of a solo fisherman, he's running a fishing business, has various kind of rooms and chambers. But what you can tell is that the main kind of courtyard in the centre, at some point right the way back in the 1st century, so it gets covered over, a roof gets put over the courtyard, and it seems to become a meeting place for a church. And so there's graffiti written in multiple languages from all over the empire by people making imprecations and prayers to Jesus in it. And it's the only kind of house of this sort of nature and so on that's been found in Capernaum. So, but it ties in so well with the biblical narrative that Jesus moves there, he lives there, Andrew lives there, Simon and his wife live there. So you get the impression that it's a kind of a bit of a working businessy complex type place. And so this particular building that's been excavated has got all of the evidence of these things in it. So yeah, it's just nice seeing the kind of hard concrete archaeological evidence of the stories we read about. And this is the house therefore that Jesus is going to make his base as he starts the next phase of his ministry, which is next time, which is his tours around Galilee. So we've kind of had this kind of moving from being a ministry that's growing and developing under John the Baptist to a kind of a negotiated trade-off position where John recognises that Jesus needs the space to grow, so perhaps has even left that space in Bethabara by moving up to Aeneon so that Jesus can move into there during that key holiday period and make lots of baptisms, which gets noted. He heads on back towards Galilee, and while he kind of arrives and does his deals and so on in Samaria, that's around that period that John gets arrested, which gives Jesus now a new release to start something new. He can't do it in Nazareth. He moves to Capernaum, makes a base in Capernaum, and it's in Capernaum that he's going to go out and call Simon Peter, James and John, and the other disciples to follow him around in a tour that's going to go around Galilee, with a new message. So it's coming to the end. So yes, got the last quote. So there's no definitive proof in this instance that the house ruins uncovered by the excavators actually is the ancient house of Peter, but there is layer upon layer of circumstantial evidence. That's the way they describe it. And that includes things like graffiti in Hebrew, Syriac and Greek, which refer to Jesus, to Christ and to Peter, all there on that excavated building. So that is this morning's session.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Yeah, really.
Thank
you.
To ask anything.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. Have we got any questions on that last section? Probably many questions that will come up as normal, but.
Yeah, and just as a quick flag, I just keep this kind of hitting people's heads and so on, is part of the reason I started to kind of do these sessions like this and produce notes for them and so on is that the plan is eventually to write the kind of little series which is to cover the whole of Jesus' life in this kind of a way. And so it's a real benefit for me to be able to kind of do what I'm doing, even though I'm at a distance, and it may not be as fun as when someone's there physically, but it's really useful for me to be able to do this to folks like yourselves. And I just want to keep flagging it. I had when I come up, I'll bring the next one in my Old Testament series book has come out. So it really helps if you want to buy those things. So think about that.
Yes.
And as we go forwards as well, I'm looking for just partners to help me keep going on this stuff, to kind of get them out. So please just think about that as we kind of go forward for the future as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Brilliant.
We will.